The tunnels were always dark. The air was heavy with dust, and the sound of iron chains dragged across stone echoed like a song of suffering. Deep underground, where light never touched, the alien girl worked with her weak hands. Her back bent, her arms trembling, her skin scarred with years of punishment. She was young, but her face looked old because of pain. No one remembered her real name anymore. The guards called her slave, and that word had become her identity. She had been here since she was a child. Her people had lost a war, and survivors were sold to the mines. Every day was the same. Break the rocks, fill the carts, push the weight through the narrow paths. If someone slowed down, the guards hit them with whips or shock sticks. If someone collapsed, they were left behind to die. She had seen friends disappear that way. After years, she no longer cried. Her tears had dried long ago. She had learned to move like a machine, silent, with no hope. That day, however, something strange happened. A group of new prisoners arrived. The guards shouted, dragging chains behind them. Among the tired, beaten figures, she noticed one who looked different. His skin was not like the others. His body was not like theirs. He was human. She had heard whispers about humans before, small creatures from a distant world, fragile, weak, easily broken. The guards laughed as they threw him into the dust. They said, "This one will not last a week." The other slaves lowered their heads, not daring to look. But the girl, for some reason, looked longer. The human did not beg. His face was bruised, his clothes torn, but his eyes burned with a strange fire. He looked around, not with fear, but with sharpness, like he was measuring the walls, the guards, the tunnels. His expression was calm, too calm for someone in chains. She had not seen such eyes before, eyes that still carried freedom inside them. It was unsettling. The work horn blew, and everyone was forced back to labor. She picked up her tool and struck the rocks, dust covering her arms and face. The human was pushed next to her, given the same heavy hammer. The guards smirked, waiting for him to fail. He lifted it, slow at first, but then struck with surprising strength. The sound rang louder than expected. Some slaves secretly glanced at him, and she felt her own chest tighten. Could it be possible? Hours passed, and the heat from the deep fires made breathing hard. She felt dizzy, but she kept moving. Suddenly, she slipped on loose stones, her heavy cart falling sideways. Rocks spilled onto the ground with a loud crash. The guards' heads snapped in her direction. Fear pierced her body like a knife. She knew what came next. One guard raised his whip, anger flashing in his eyes. She closed her own eyes, bracing for the pain. But it didn't fall. A new sound broke through, the sound of iron clashing against a whip. When she opened her eyes, she saw the human. He had stepped between her and the guard. With his chain-wrapped arm, he had blocked the whip. The guard's mouth opened in shock, then in rage. No one ever resisted. Slaves never protected each other. Yet here he was, standing tall despite the bruises, his eyes burning brighter. The other guards rushed forward, shouting. They beat him with sticks, pushing him down, but he did not cry out. He took every strike in silence, his jaw tight, his gaze steady. The alien girl could only stare, frozen. Something inside her chest stirred, something she had not felt in years. It was not fear. It was not sorrow. It was something she could barely name. A small, dangerous spark, hope. When the beating ended, the human lay on the ground, his body bleeding. The guards laughed and kicked dust at him. "See? Weak," they said. But even then, he lifted his head, looked straight at the girl, and gave a faint smile. Not a smile of joy, but of defiance, like he was saying, "They cannot break me." That night, when the slaves were locked in their cages, she could not sleep. The image of him standing in front of the whip replayed in her mind. Why would anyone do that? No one ever fought for her. No one ever cared if she lived or died. She remembered how her people had abandoned her to the mines, how even the strongest had bowed their heads. Yet this human, a stranger, had stepped forward. Her body trembled, not from cold, but from confusion. She pressed her hand against the scars on her arm. All her life, she believed she was nothing but a tool, broken and useless. But his eyes, his smile, made her question that belief. Maybe, just maybe, she was more than a slave. The darkness around her was still the same. The chains on her wrists were still heavy. The guards were still cruel. Yet the mine no longer felt completely dead. Somewhere inside that pristone and fire, a flame had been lit. She did not know how long it would last, or if it would be crushed tomorrow. But for the first time in years, she felt it. the fragile possibility of change. And it had come from the human. The next morning began like every other, with a loud horn that shook the tunnels. The slaves rose slowly, their chains clinking as they moved. The air smelled of sweat, blood, and burning metal. The alien girl rubbed her aching wrists, her eyes dull from another night of little rest. She expected another day of endless labor, another day of silence. But the human's presence from yesterday still stayed in her mind like an echo. She remembered how he stood between her and the whip. She had tried to push the thought away, but it kept returning, strange and unsettling. When the guards barked orders, the slaves lined up for food. It was not really food, only a thin gray paste served in cracked bowls. Most swallowed it quickly, afraid of losing even this small portion. The human, however, did something unexpected again. He broke his own bowl in half and slid part of his share toward an old alien with trembling hands. The guards did not notice, but the girl did. No slave ever shared. To survive, you had to think of yourself. Yet this human gave away food he needed for his own strength. She tried not to stare, but her heart beat faster. Work began soon after. The guards pushed them into the deep tunnels where the rocks glowed faintly from the heat below. Each strike of the hammer shook her thin arms, but she did not stop. Her scars burned with sweat. Beside her, the human raised his tool and struck hard. The sound was sharp and strong, like before. Some slaves looked up at him for a moment, then lowered their heads again quickly, afraid to show interest. The guards noticed the sound too. Their leader, a tall alien with red scars across his face, narrowed his eyes. He walked over, his boots heavy on the stone floor. He stared at the human. "So," he sneered, "the little weakling thinks he can work like us." He shoved him hard, expecting him to fall. But the human did not stumble. He stood straight, his breathing steady. That calm defiance made the guard's anger boil. The girl's chest tightened. She knew what was coming. The guard raised his whip, ready to make an example out of him. The other slaves shrank back, avoiding eye contact, hoping not to be chosen next. But before the whip could strike, the human spoke. His voice was not loud, but it was clear. "You are afraid of me," he said. The words were shocking. No slave ever spoke back, not even in whispers. The guard froze for a second, then his face twisted with rage. He lashed out with the whip. The human raised his chained arms, blocking it once again, the same way he had done yesterday. Sparks flew where metal met leather. The guards gasped, their laughter dying. For a heartbeat, silence filled the tunnel. Then chaos erupted. 2 guards rushed in, swinging their sticks at him. The human ducked one blow and shoved another back with surprising force, even while chained. The slaves gasped quietly, their eyes wide with disbelief. A human, fighting against armed guards. It was madness. But it was happening right in front of them. The alien girl gripped her hammer tighter. She could hardly breathe. Each strike, each block, each defiant move of the human burned into her mind. It was dangerous, foolish, and yet powerful. He was not fighting for victory. He was fighting to show he would not bow. That realization struck her deeper than any whip ever had. The guards finally overpowered him, beating him to the ground with sticks. Blood ran down his face, staining the dirt. The leader spat at him and shouted, "You are nothing. You will break like the rest." The human coughed, but when he lifted his head, his eyes still carried that same fire. "Not today," he whispered. The girl felt her stomach twist. Something inside her cracked open. For years, she had believed survival meant silence, obedience, and fear. But this human, broken and bleeding, still refused to surrender. His defiance made her question everything she thought was true. The guards dragged him away as punishment. They locked him in a small cage, separate from the others, with no food or water. The slaves returned to their labor, the sound of hammers echoing again. Yet the air had changed. Whispers passed between them, too soft for guards to hear. They whispered about the human who stood against the whip, who faced the guards without fear. That night, when the girl was returned to her cage with the others, she could not rest again. She stared through the bars, across the shadows, where the human sat alone. His body looked broken, but he held his head high. In the silence of the mine, their eyes met for a brief second. He gave her a small nod, nothing more. Yet it felt like a message. Her heart raced. Why did he do it? Why risk so much for nothing? Was it madness, or was it strength she had never understood before? She touched the cold chains around her wrists and wondered if they were as unbreakable as she once thought. The guards believed they had humiliated him. They laughed, thinking they had crushed his spirit. But she knew better. She had seen the truth in his eyes. They had not broken him. They had only made him stronger. And somewhere inside her, a tiny voice whispered a dangerous thought. Maybe he could make her stronger too. In the endless dark of the mines, where no hope had lived for years, the human's defiance was a spark. And even the smallest spark could grow into fire. Days passed, but the memory of that fight did not fade. The slaves spoke in whispers when the guards were not near. Some said the human was foolish, that he would die soon. Others, secretly, admired his courage. The alien girl said nothing, but inside her heart something had begun to stir. She could not erase the image of him standing against the whip. She tried to kill the thought, but it always came back like a flame that refused to die. The guards punished the human by keeping him away from the rest. He was given less food, less water, and forced to carry heavier loads. But no matter what they did, he did not break. His steps stayed strong, his eyes unbowed. The girl noticed every detail. She watched from a distance, stealing glances when she thought no one was looking. He was different, and she knew it. One evening after a long shift, the slaves were returned to their cages. The girl sat against the cold bars, exhausted. Her hands shook from hunger. She pressed her forehead to her knees, trying to fight the emptiness inside. Then, quietly, something slid across the dirt toward her. She lifted her head and saw a small piece of bread resting by her hand. She froze, her eyes darting around. Who had done it? Her gaze shifted, and there he was, the human, sitting in the shadow of his cage. His face was bruised, but his eyes glimmered faintly in the dark. He gave the slightest nod, as if telling her to take it. She hesitated, her throat dry. No one shared food. If the guards discovered it, they would beat both of them. But her stomach ached, and her strength was nearly gone. She picked up the bread, holding it carefully. For the first time in years, she felt like someone saw her, not as a slave, but as a living being. She ate slowly, her hands trembling. The taste was rough and old, but to her it was like a feast. She wanted to thank him, but words would not come. Her voice had grown weak from silence. Still, when she looked back at him, he was watching her, his expression calm. Then, without speaking, he leaned back and closed his eyes. The next day in the tunnels, their workstations were close again. The girl was lifting heavy rocks, her arms burning with pain. She dropped one by mistake, and a guard noticed. He stomped toward her, his whip ready. Her heart raced, knowing punishment was coming. But before the strike could fall, the human stepped forward and grabbed the rock himself. "It was mine," he said firmly. The guard narrowed his eyes, glaring at him. After a tense pause, the guard spat on the ground and walked away. The girl stared at him in disbelief. No one ever claimed another's mistake. Why would he risk another beating for her? He turned his head slightly and whispered so only she could hear. "You are not broken." The words pierced her like lightning. She had not heard kindness in years, maybe never. For a moment, she forgot the chains on her wrists. She forgot the walls of stone around her. His words felt heavier than the rocks they carried, but also warmer than any fire she had known. That night, when they were locked away again, she found herself glancing toward him more often. His body looked tired, but his eyes never lost that steady fire. She wondered if he had always been like this, or if something had shaped him to fight this way. She wanted to ask, but fear sealed her lips. She was not ready to trust her own voice. In the days that followed, small moments continued. A hidden sip of water passed through bars, a nod of encouragement when her arms grew weak, a quick step forward when danger approached. None of it was loud. None of it was grand. But each time, the bond between them grew stronger, though unspoken. The other slaves began to notice too. Some whispered warnings to her. "Stay away, he will bring trouble." Others only watched, curious but silent. The guards, however, grew suspicious. They had seen the human's defiance. They had seen the way the girl looked at him when she thought no one noticed. Whispers traveled even among the cruel. If hope was spreading, it needed to be crushed. One afternoon, a guard decided to test her. He threw a heavy load toward her, more than she could carry. "Do it, slave," he barked. She tried, her legs shaking, her back screaming in pain. She collapsed, the stones spilling across the ground. The guard raised his whip, smiling with cruelty. But the human stepped in again, lifting half the stones with his chained arms. The guard's eyes narrowed dangerously. This time, he did not beat the human immediately. Instead, he studied the girl, then him. His smile twisted. "So, you two protect each other?" he hissed. He leaned close to the girl, his breath foul, and said, "Maybe I should break him in front of you. Then you will remember your place." Her blood froze, fear flooding her chest. She wanted to shout, to stop it, but her throat refused to work. The guard dragged the human aside, beating him harshly while she watched. Every strike of the stick felt like it landed on her own skin. Her nails dug into her palms, her eyes burning. For the first time in years, she wanted to scream. When the guards finally left, the human lay in the dirt, bloody but alive. He turned his head toward her, barely able to lift it. Yet even in his broken state, his lips curved into the faintest smile. She pressed her hand to her mouth, holding back tears. That night, when silence returned, she crawled close to the bars separating them. In the darkness, she whispered for the first time in many years. Her voice cracked, weak, but the words escaped. "Why? Why do you help me?" For a moment, she thought he would not answer. But then his quiet reply came. "Because you are worth it." Her heart pounded so hard she thought the guards would hear. Worth it. No one had ever told her that before. She leaned against the bars, her eyes wet with tears she thought had long died. The mine was still dark, the chain still heavy, but inside her chest, something had changed. She was no longer completely alone. And in that silence, a bond was born, silent, fragile, but unbreakable. The mine was restless that day. The guards walked with sharper eyes, their steps louder, their tempers shorter. Something in the air felt different, heavy like a storm about to break. The alien girl sensed it too. For days she had felt a strange warmth inside her, a fragile bond forming with the human. But now, as she saw the way the guards whispered among themselves and kept glancing at them, fear twisted in her stomach. She knew they had noticed. The human worked as always, striking the rocks with steady rhythm, his body bruised, but his spirit unshaken. Every strike sounded like defiance, a challenge echoing through the tunnels. The girl tried to keep her head down, to appear invisible, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. She did not want the guards to see, but it was too late. They had already seen everything. At midday, when the slaves were most tired, the guards acted. Without warning, two of them grabbed the human by his arms and yanked him away from the line. Chains rattled as he stumbled, but he did not resist. The leader, the scarred one with cruel eyes, stepped forward. "This one thinks he is strong," he sneered. "This one thinks he can protect others. Today we will show all of you what happens to fools." The girl's heart pounded. She froze, her hammer slipping from her hands. The slaves all lowered their eyes, pretending not to watch. But she could not look away. The guards dragged him to the center of the cavern, where the stone floor was stained with old blood. They threw him down, then beat him with rods, each strike echoing in the air. The sound of bone against iron made her flinch, yet the human did not cry out. He gritted his teeth, his jaw tight, his eyes locked on the leader. The scarred guard grew angrier. He wanted screams. He wanted fear. He shouted, "Beg, human, beg, and maybe we let you live." The human spat blood to the ground and whispered, "Never." His voice was hoarse but steady. The cavern went silent for a moment. Even the slaves dared to lift their heads slightly, shocked at his refusal. The guards struck harder, but the girl could barely hear them anymore. Her blood rushed in her ears, her vision blurred. Watching him suffer tore at her chest. Every hit felt like fire burning inside her. For so long she had accepted pain as normal, but now it felt unbearable. She wanted to scream, to fight, but her body trembled with helplessness. Her knees shook, her hands curled into fists. She remembered the words he had told her. "You are not broken." She remembered how he had shared food, how he had stood in front of the whip, how he had whispered that she was worth it. Now he was paying for all of it, and she could do nothing. The guilt crushed her, mixing with anger until she could hardly breathe. One of the guards pushed him down harder, grinding his face into the dirt. The leader laughed cruelly. "Look at your hero now," he barked to the slaves. "See how even he is nothing." He wanted to kill hope. He wanted everyone to believe resistance was useless. But when the human lifted his head again, blood dripping from his lips, his eyes were still the same, defiant, burning. alive. And when his gaze met hers across the cavern, something broke inside her. She could no longer pretend to be silent. She could no longer hide behind fear. Her body moved before her mind caught up. She stepped forward, her chains rattling, her heart racing like a drum. The slaves around her gasped, pulling back in shock. She had not spoken in years, had not dared to raise her head. But now her voice ripped from her throat, raw and shaking. "Stop!" The word echoed through the cavern. The guards turned sharply, their eyes narrowing at her. The leader sneered. "So the broken one finds her tongue." He walked toward her, circling like a predator. "You want to protect him too? Then you will share his punishment." He raised his whip, his eyes glinting with cruelty. Her knees wanted to buckle, her hands shook, but something in her chest held her upright. She felt fear, yes, but also something stronger, rage. Rage at years of chains, at the loss of her people, at the cruelty that had stolen her childhood. Rage that burned hotter because of the human's defiance. She clenched her fists, her voice trembling but firm. "You will not break him." The leader laughed, a harsh sound that filled the air. "You think you matter? You are nothing." He lashed the whip across her arm, pain exploding through her body. She staggered but did not fall. She bit back a scream, her teeth sinking into her lip until blood filled her mouth. The guards laughed louder, mocking her weakness. But the human, even through his pain, pushed himself up slightly, his eyes blazing with pride. The girl's body shook, but deep inside, something had awakened. For the first time, she felt a spark of strength not from survival, but from choice. She was no longer only enduring, she was resisting. And though she still trembled, she knew the guards had made a mistake. By trying to break the human, they had lit a fire inside her. The punishment continued until both of them collapsed, their bodies broken and bruised. The guards left them in the dirt, half laughing, certain they had crushed any hope of rebellion. But they were wrong. When the girl crawled weakly to the human side, she saw his faint smile. He whispered with a voice almost gone, "They cannot kill it." She knew what he meant. They could beat their bodies, but not the fire inside. As she lay beside him, pain searing every part of her, she realized the truth. She was no longer afraid of the guards the same way. They could hurt her, but they could not control what burned inside her heart. For years, she had been silent, but now she had found her voice. And for the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to fight. That night, locked in her cage again, her wounds throbbing, she stared at the dark ceiling. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks, but they were not only from pain. They were from something stronger, a decision. She would not let the human stand alone anymore. If they tried to break him again, they would have to break her too. And that thought, strange and frightening, gave her strength. The chains still held her body, but her spirit had shifted. She was no longer only a slave. Something had begun to awaken, something the guards would never understand. The days after the punishment were filled with silence. The girl's wounds burned whenever she moved, and the human's body looked broken in more ways than one. Yet, despite their pain, a strange energy began to spread among the slaves. They had seen what happened. They had seen the girl raise her voice, and they had seen the human refuse to bow. The guards thought they had crushed hope, but instead they had planted it. Whispers moved quietly in the dark corners of the cages. The girl noticed how other slaves now looked at the human differently. Before, they had avoided him, fearing his defiance would bring only more pain. Now their eyes carried something else, curiosity, maybe even respect. And when their eyes moved to her, she felt a strange weight. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just another body. She had spoken, and that one word, "stop," still echoed in the tunnels. The human, even while healing, continued to act with the same fire. When the guards forced him to work, he worked. When they hit him, he endured. But at night, in the shadows, he leaned close to the girl and whispered words she never thought she would hear. "We cannot stay here forever," he said softly. "We must escape." Her heart stopped at the word. Escape. No one escaped. The mines had taken thousands, and none had ever returned. The walls were endless, the guards countless, the chains unbreakable. She wanted to tell him it was impossible, but when she looked at him, she saw his certainty. He was not dreaming. He was planning. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "No one escapes alive." He leaned closer, his eyes steady even in the dark. "Then we will be the first." The words struck her like a hammer. She wanted to reject them, to hide in the safety of hopelessness, but part of her could not. The fire she had felt when she stood against the whip flared again. The idea was terrifying, but also thrilling. She had never allowed herself to imagine freedom. And now with him, the picture began to form in her mind. A sky without chains, air without dust, a world beyond stone walls. The days that followed changed. Every action, every moment of work carried a secret rhythm. The human began to study the tunnels carefully, watching the patterns of guards, the timing of patrols, the cracks in the walls. He noticed things no one else dared to see. Sometimes, while lifting rocks, he whispered quick instructions to her. Watch the left tunnel at night. Fewer guards. This wall is weak here. Count the steps between patrols. At first, her fear made her stiff, but slowly she began to see what he saw. She noticed the same gaps, the same patterns. The mine was not only chains and hopelessness, it had weaknesses. One night, while the guards dozed half asleep by their fire, the human slid a sharp piece of stone under his chains. He worked at it slowly, hiding the sound with coughs. When he managed to scrape one link, he slipped the shard to the girl. Her hands trembled as she held it, the idea of resistance shaking her to her core. "Why give it to me?" she whispered. His reply was simple. "Because I trust you." Her breath caught. Trust was a word she had forgotten. To be trusted felt heavier than chains. She hid the shard carefully and worked on her own restraints in secret, her hands bleeding as the sharp edge cut her skin. Each scrape, each scratch filled her with both terror and hope. The guards noticed none of it, but they did notice something else. The girl was changing. She no longer moved with the lifeless steps of a broken slave. Her eyes were sharper, her movements steadier. It unsettled them. They whispered to each other, watching more closely. Suspicion grew, but so did her resolve. One evening, after a long day of labor, the human leaned close to her again. "Soon," he murmured. "When the storm comes, the guards will be distracted. That will be our chance." Her heart thumped loudly. A storm. The mines always shook when lightning crashed above, and guards hated patrolling then. It was dangerous, chaotic, the perfect cover. She swallowed hard. "If we are caught, they will kill us." "They will kill us anyway," he answered simply. His words were cold but true. Life in the mines was no life at all. She looked into his eyes and saw no hesitation. For the first time, she allowed herself to nod. That night, she lay awake in her cage, staring at the dripping ceiling. Fear gnawed at her stomach, but beneath it, something else grew. She thought of her family, long lost. She thought of the years she had wasted in chains. And she thought of the human, beaten yet unbroken, who had given her a piece of his strength. For the first time in her life, she dared to whisper to herself, "Maybe I can be free." The plan was dangerous, reckless, maybe even impossible. But it was a plan. And the thought of it filled her with a strange kind of power. Her body was weak, her spirit scarred, but when she pictured the storm above, she also pictured herself stepping out of the mines for the first time in years. The image burned so brightly in her mind that even the darkness of the cage could not snuff it out. The human was right. They could not stay here forever. One way or another, the mines would no longer hold them. And though fear still lived inside her, hope had grown stronger. It was a seed now, fragile but alive. When the horn blew the next morning and the chains dragged once more, the girl did not feel only like a slave. She felt like someone preparing for war. And this time, she was not alone. The human walked beside her, and his steady gaze told her everything she needed to know. Their time was coming. The storm came without warning. Thunder roared above the mountains, shaking the tunnels deep underground. Rain poured through cracks in the ceiling, dripping onto stone floors and turning the dust into mud. The guards cursed loudly, their voices sharp with fear. They hated storms, for the ground trembled and the tunnels sometimes collapsed. Their patrols grew sloppy, their attention weaker, their minds only on survival. The human had waited for this moment. His eyes glimmered in the flickering torchlight as he glanced at the girl. She knew what it meant. Her chest tightened, her hands trembling, but she gave the smallest nod. Tonight was the night. There would be no second chance. The slaves were herded back into their cages as the storm raged. The guards shouted to each other, their words drowned by thunder. When the torches dimmed, and the noise of the storm masked the sounds of chains. The human slipped his sharp stone into his hands. He scraped faster than ever, his wrists bleeding as he worked at the iron links. The girl pressed her back to the bars, hiding his movements from the guard's lazy eyes. Minutes passed like hours, her heart pounding with every scrape. Then, with a soft snap, his chain broke. He breathed hard, his wrists raw, but his face steady. He crawled closer to her cage, sliding the shard through the bars. Her fingers shook as she grabbed it. She scraped at her own chains, biting her lips so hard she tasted blood to keep from making a sound. Sparks jumped, iron scraped, and finally her wrist slipped free. She almost cried out from relief, but his sharp gaze reminded her. Silence was survival. When both of them were unbound, they crouched low, waiting. The guards had gathered near the entrance, distracted by the thunder above. The human whispered, "Now!" His voice was steady, but her whole body trembled. He pushed her cage open with a quiet creak, then his own. For the first time in years, she stepped out without chains. Her legs shook like they belonged to someone else. They moved into the shadows of the tunnel, their breaths shallow. Every step felt like walking through fire. Freedom was close, but danger closer. One wrong sound, and they would both die. They reached the first corner, pressed against the wall, listening. A guard passed by, muttering angrily about the storm. His boots splashed in puddles, his torch casting sharp light. The human waited until the guard turned his back, then struck fast. With his chains wrapped around his fist, he hit the guard across the head. The torch clattered to the ground, the body silent. The girl froze, her stomach twisting. She had never seen such violence so close, but the human grabbed her hand, pulling her forward. "No time," he whispered. She nodded, her breath ragged. They moved deeper through the maze of tunnels, heading toward the old mining shaft the human had studied. The storm outside howled, shaking dust from the ceiling. Every noise felt louder, every second longer. Twice they had to duck into dark alcoves as patrols passed by. Her body trembled, fear eating her alive. But every time she looked at him, his eyes were calm, burning with the same fire that had never left him. That fire kept her moving. At one turn, disaster struck. A guard spotted them. His torchlight flashed across their faces, his mouth opening to shout. Before he could, the girl acted without thinking. She lunged forward, slamming the shard of stone into his arm. He cried out, dropping the torch, and the human finished him with a heavy strike. The girl gasped, her whole body shaking. She had never fought before, never raised a hand against anyone. Yet in that moment, she had saved them. The human looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dark. Then he whispered, "Good." Just one word, but it made her chest tighten. For the first time, she felt like she was not only surviving, she was fighting. They pressed on, the air growing colder as they reached the higher shafts. The storm's roar grew louder, rain pouring through cracks like rivers. At last, they saw it. The old shaft, half collapsed, but still leading upward. Broken ladders clung to the walls, slick with water. The human went first, his muscles straining as he climbed. The girl followed, her hands slipping, her breath shallow. Every rung felt like it would snap. Below, shouts echoed. The guards had found the bodies. The alarm rang through the tunnels. Her heart pounded wildly as she climbed faster. Rocks broke loose, falling into the dark. The ladder shook violently as the storm rattled the shaft. Her hands bled, her legs screamed, but she refused to stop. She could hear the guards below, their voices furious, their torches glowing like angry eyes in the dark. The human reached a broken ledge and pulled himself up, then stretched down to her. "Give me your hand!" he shouted over the storm. She reached, her fingers barely brushing his. For a second, she thought she would fall, but he grabbed her tight and pulled her onto the ledge. She collapsed beside him, gasping for air. The tunnel above opened wider, and a blast of cold, fresh wind hit her face. She froze. She had not felt real air in years. It filled her lungs, sharp and alive, and tears burned her eyes. Freedom was close enough to taste. But behind them, the sound of boots grew nearer. The guards were coming. The human pulled her up again, his grip strong. "We're not done yet," he said firmly. She nodded, wiping her tears. Together they ran, stumbling through the last stretch of the tunnel as lightning cracked above, guiding their path. The storm was wild, the earth shaking, the sky tearing itself apart. But for the first time in her life, the storm did not feel like danger. It felt like the world itself was breaking her chains. The girl's body was weak. Her breath ragged, but inside her chest fire blazed. She was no longer a slave hiding in shadows. She was someone running toward freedom, side by side with the only person who had ever believed in her. And as they neared the mouth of the shaft, where a faint line of light shone through the rain, she felt it. The impossible was no longer impossible. The tunnel burst open into the night. Cold wind struck her face, carrying the scent of rain and soil. For a moment, she could not move. After so many years underground, the sky seemed unreal, vast, endless, alive with lightning. She gasped, her eyes wide, her chest trembling. She wanted to fall to her knees, to cry, to laugh, but there was no time. Behind them, shouts echoed. The guards were chasing, their torches like fire snakes in the dark. The human grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. They stumbled into the storm, the ground slippery with mud. Rain soaked their skin, washing away the dust of the mines. Every step was heavy, her legs weak from years of chains, but she forced herself to run. The human never let go of her hand. His grip was iron, unyielding, pulling her whenever she faltered. The storm raged with fury. Trees bent under the wind, rivers of water rushed down the slopes, lightning split the sky, showing flashes of their desperate escape. The guards were not far. Their voices cut through the thunder, their boots crashing against the earth. The girl's chest burned, her breath sharp, but the human's voice reached her. "Keep going." She nodded, even as her body screamed in pain. They ran toward the forest beyond the hills. Branches whipped at their faces, mud sucked at their feet. The girl slipped and fell, her knees slamming into the ground. She cried out, but before fear could take her, the human was there. He lifted her onto her feet, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. She leaned against him, half running, half dragged, but together they moved. Behind them, the guards grew closer. Arrows flew through the rain, missing narrowly, thudding into trees. One struck the ground beside her, spraying mud. She flinched, her heart nearly stopping. The human shielded her with his body, pushing her forward. "Don't look back," he said firmly. His voice, calm even in chaos, gave her strength. They reached a river swollen by the storm. The water roared, wild and merciless. Crossing it seemed impossible. She stared in fear, her body shaking. "We cannot," she whispered. The human looked at her, his face steady despite the blood and rain. "We must," he answered. Without hesitation, he stepped into the current, pulling her with him. The water was icy, crashing against their bodies. It dragged at their legs. They tried to pull them under. She coughed, choking on the spray, clinging desperately to his arm. The guards reached the riverbank, their shouts furious, but the storm's roar swallowed their words. Some tried to follow, but the current was too strong. The girl's vision blurred, her strength fading, but the human held her tight. Step by step, they fought through, until at last they stumbled onto the far shore, collapsing in the mud. For a few breaths, they lay side by side, gasping, the storm pouring over them. The guards' voices were distant now, fading with the roar of the river between them. They had done it. They had crossed. For the first time, the chains of the mine were far behind. The girl rolled onto her back, staring at the sky. She had not seen stars in years, and now, through cracks in the storm, faint lights shimmered. Tears slid down her cheeks, mixing with the rain. She whispered, almost not believing her own voice, "We are free." The human turned his head toward her. His face was bruised, bloodied, but his eyes still carried that same fire. He gave a faint smile. "Yes," he said softly, "you are free now." Her chest ached with emotions she could not name. Gratitude, relief, sorrow for years lost, and something new, a fragile but growing bond that felt unbreakable. She reached for his hand in the mud, and he clasped it firmly. But freedom was not simple. They still had to survive. The forest stretched wide, filled with shadows and unknown dangers. The storm continued to rage, and their bodies were weak. Yet, as they lay there, she felt stronger than she had ever felt in her life. Not because her body was powerful, but because her spirit was no longer chained. When the storm finally began to quiet, the human rose slowly and helped her up. "We must move before they find another way across," he said. She nodded, wiping the mud from her face. Together they walked into the forest, each step heavy but full of purpose. As they moved deeper among the trees, the girl thought of the past. Years of darkness, of chains, of silence. She remembered how she once believed she was nothing but a broken tool. And now, here she was, walking under the open sky, breathing air that was her own. The human had given her more than freedom. He had given her back herself. She looked at him, his figure strong even in exhaustion, and whispered words she never thought she would say. "You changed my life." He stopped for a moment, meeting her eyes. Rain dripped from his hair, his face lit faintly by the breaking dawn. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he squeezed her hand gently. "No," he said. "You changed your own life. I only reminded you who you are." Her heart tightened at his words. She realized then that this journey was not only about escape. It was about becoming someone new, someone unbroken. The chains had been heavy, but her spirit had proven stronger. The sky began to lighten with dawn. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean. The forest glistened with water, and birds began to call softly in the trees. For the first time in her memory, the girl felt the warmth of morning touch her face. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the moment fill her. The human stood beside her, silent but steady. Together, they looked toward the horizon. Their path was uncertain, filled with dangers and challenges yet to come. But it no longer mattered. She was free, and she was not alone. The mines were behind her. The chains were gone. And ahead, for the first time, stretched a life she could call her own.